Okay, thank you, everybody. We are all checked in. So now it is time to to begin the fishbowl discussion. So I'm going to type the invitation into the chat, but it is based on your experience. Discuss the good, the bad, the ugly. The good, the bad, and the ugly of implementing self-management and new ways of working. So that's I'm going to hit mute now and turn my video off. So it's over to you guys. And at about halfway through the hour, I'm going to pick out some questions from the Google Doc, which I will share again in the chat. Okay, see you soon.
Great, so we can just time box this at 5 minutes, you think, and put this question to bed and then move on to the next one? Hilarious. Should we start with the good? Be fun. Yeah, I guess yeah, sure. I'll throw something into the mix. I think it's been interesting in this moment of upheaval and weirdness and disconnection, et cetera, to just watch, some of the companies that have either been on, or through this journey to something different than traditional hierarchical bureaucracy, thrive and survive and navigate and pivot and adapt. And I don't know, I sense a liveliness in the companies that I know and respect in the space that I don't sense in those that are really struggling for connection and struggling for answers and struggling for back to normal, whatever the hell that means. So that's been, I guess, my most recent experience of the good.
Yeah, I'll jump on the back of that one, Aaron. The one that comes to mind so strongly for me here in New Zealand is an organization called Tautoko Services, a disability services organization, who have been on the journey for about 2.5 years. And obviously in many circumstances when both having to start working from home, and especially those that are looking after the most vulnerable in society, the practices of being self-managing and self-organizing, feeling emboldened to take decisions, feeling like they kind of know how to do this, allowed them to, have probably a much better experience than many of the other organizations that are still hierarchical, having to go to the center for all decisions, not quite knowing what they're doing. So that kind of stands out for me as one of the big benefits in these times in that particular sector.
That's cool.
I'm happy to chip in there. What I'm noticing is that there's a next generation of people coming into the workforce, and in organizations that are stepping up and being self-organizing and self-managing, they're finding space to really stretch their wings and fly, to be valued, to feel belonging, to figure things out in their own way. And I really think to develop their agency and to just develop social practices of togetherness. So I really feel it gives, for me, lots of hope for the next generation coming into the workforce.
That's cool.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that one from Samantha. That was sort of on my mind too. This thing of belonging, togetherness, connection, purpose. Like, I think it used to be back before my day. I think it used to be the case that people got a lot of that from their work, and that seems to have evaporated to a certain extent. And I think a lot of what's driving this push for more self-management is about, I want a place to belong. I want a sense of ownership. I want to feel like these are my people. And this thing of like, we talk about bringing your whole self into the workplace. That's part of it. It's like not just this little narrow facet of me, but all of me is here, and I feel like I'm allowed. I've got more permission to be more of myself. And the purpose thing, like, I don't know about you all, but I'm pretty at my best. I'm quite motivated by all of the things that are happening in the world that give me a lot of concern, and to feel like I can choose a work path that is aligned to making some kind of positive contribution, and like steer us into this optimistic future. That, yeah, I don't think I could work another way anymore now that I've tasted that purpose thing. Karin, I think I cut you off. You're about to say something.
No problem. I think it's good that it's not awkward anymore, awkward and weird. I've been doing this for a long time, and it was really painful in the beginning. So it's not, it's more like it's accepted and the people want to try it on. So that's good. And also somebody said something about paradoxes. I think it was you, Samantha. So it goes quickly. It doesn't take long, at least in graspable organizations that aren't super big. And on the same time, it sort of takes time. So it's weird. But the good thing is that it doesn't take so much time, and the change is much easier when you involve people. So that's the good.
It's funny what you said, Richard, piggybacking off of, I think, Lisa or Susan. What strikes me is like community has died mostly, certainly in America, where like I don't have community with my neighbors anymore in any meaningful way. And so now, like, if I also don't have that at work, it's especially a gaping hole. So it does feel like we're now like reverse filling that by looking back to work for community, and just generally looking to like remote networks and connections is like I feel more connected to you all, who I barely hang out with, because our belief systems are interconnected in a way that like my neighbors probably aren't. So yeah.
I think something that I would like to add that I think really came through when Karin and I were pulling together the stories for our book was I'm always struck by just how accelerated development is, you know, human development when we work together in this way, that when we're all, because of that mindset shift towards, you know, which is the same thing you were talking to Aaron about, why I think companies that are exploring these ways of working are so much more resilient, is when you all have access to information and no one's kind of protecting you or hiding things from you, which is often well-intentioned, then we all see it as ours together, and we work on it together. And when we see it as ours, then we all step into things that we wouldn't otherwise get the opportunity to do. And all kinds of talents and skills and competencies get revealed, but also developed, you know, when people are like, well, we don't have that skill set here, but I'd be willing to try. And then suddenly, you know, just huge development curves happen, I think, which is really fun. And maybe similar to what you were saying, Richard, that in the same way that, oh no, I think it was you, Aaron, saying about community, in the same way that we're sort of longing for community, I think we're also longing for development and starting to see work as a place that we can do that in a way that's not, you know, some constrained budget given to me by HR or L&D, but more like self-directed, you know, learning continuously together.
Oh, Pim, you're on mute.
I'm muted. Yeah, I very much agree with what Lisa's saying. And I think what is now the current crisis, or crises actually, that we're experiencing, I think what is interesting to see, if you now look at organizations that have already gone down the path of becoming more progressive or more self-managing or whatever you want to call it, that people, because they feel that they are really part of the business, as Lisa was saying, like they're really also in tough times, like really stand up, put in more effort, commit even more to the organization and its purpose. And I think this is quite interesting to see, right? Because in traditional organizations where there's not a lot of solidarity and there's a lot of secrecy around all kinds of information, people feel scared. There's a lot of fear that they might lose their job, and people kind of retract from the organization.
Close down.
I think that's an interesting thing to see now. People always say, well, self-management works great, especially in good times, but in bad times, then people will start abusing the freedom that they have or the trust that they get. But especially now in times like these, you see that people actually abuse the trust even less, or show even more commitment to the organization and its purpose. And I think that's a good side effect of this crisis, that we're actually seeing once again that this other alternative way of working it's not just better in good times, but also better in bad times.
Yeah, Pim, what pinged for me there is, you know, the well-worn memes that we hear around, oh, if we give people too much freedom, then they're going to abuse it. I've never seen that happen actually in reality. So that's quite interesting to think about it from that perspective. Yeah, I think that dovetailing from what we've all said around the idea that if we can trust each other enough, if we can expect our peers to be willing to have the conversations that are about not only what the workplace needs, but what we need as humans, and be able to do that in a way that doesn't seem or feel either too scary or too outside of the realm of what we're trying to do together, and do that in the workplace, I feel like that has the potential to transform everything. And as Lisa said, make visible the opportunities for development that we've just ignored for so long. You know, Erin, one of the parts I love about your book so much is looking at, you know, what hasn't changed in the last 100 years. And I think that what hasn't changed, or what is starting to change, is we're starting to become aware of these things that we always just took for granted or ignored as our inheritance, and not realizing that if we notice these things and name them, then we can change them.
Totally. And it's so funny you say that, because one of the things I didn't get a chance to write about, and now is so obvious to me, that has come up in conversation at the Ready a lot lately, is in this big moment of like DEI awareness and upheaval, we're now tracing the thread back and being like, wait a second, most of the ways of working that we take for granted came before women had the right to vote, came before the civil rights movement, came before a lot of these things that we now think of as normal were true. So of course, how could they be designed to deliver, you know, kind of harmony and connection and, you know, value and balance? Like it's just mind blowing to think about that, right? Like the Gantt chart was invented before women could vote. Just hold that in your mind the next time you make one.
I think it's important to make the link with the equity, more equitable world and the whole inclusion movement as well, because I mean, I think that by going self-organizing and self-managing, we're really going deeper into more equitable ways of functioning together as human beings, and much more inclusive ways of functioning together. And I think we can start making the link between all of that.
Yeah, I think coming off of that, I think that to me is becoming a real learning edge, I think, for this movement, is that, you know, it's been a few years now since Frederick Laloux's book, and, you know, all of us here, we've all written books on this subject, and that's still quite new in a sense, even though a lot of these ways of working aren't new per se. But I think that now that we are going deeper, there is a deeper learning edge around, you know, looking at power dynamics and how do we start to unlearn so much of that stuff. And this is happening in kind of social justice and inclusion movements all around the world as well, but it's happening in a work context too. And I'm really interested in how we can do that, how we can kind of relearn together how to be together, how to relate to each other. And I think that's really challenging and kind of new ground in the work context, at least. But there are lots of practices we can, and other fields we can draw on.
And the link with new economics, I think, is important too. So really thinking about practices around finances and the assumptions we have around ownership, which don't really make sense so much, and that we should be re-questioning. And I think that links too. And I'm happy that just by stepping into the field of self-organizing and self-managing ways, it kind of leads you at one point to start questioning some of the assumptions we have about how we function around finances and ownership as well.
It's such a weird moment of collision for all that stuff, right? Because you can just see like rampant inequality, issues around diversity and inclusion, issues around the brittleness of hierarchy to address these complex challenges. And it just feels like, I don't know, sometimes it feels hopeless, sometimes it feels hopeful, but it definitely feels revolutionary and destructive. Like in many ways, I often joke with our team that like we're trying to soften the blow of what otherwise would be a very violent transition. Like that's, in some ways, that's what I think we actually do, is we're actually trying to like smooth what would otherwise be a real revolution, which by the way is not a pleasant thing to be a part of usually. Like real revolution is rough. But sometimes I worry like about speed and pace and whether we need, I don't know, it's just, it feels like such a convergence moment for me. And I don't know if that's just like the myopia of being in that current generation. Everybody always thinks they're in like the most important generation, but it certainly feels like it to me. Popcorn has stopped popping on the good. Should we switch to something more saucy?
Yeah, that's what I came here for.
Yeah, Rich's conflict.
I want to know.
Go, Rich, go.
Well, no, I'm just curious about you. I mean, I've got a list in my head of the bad and the ugly, but I'm curious what you all have seen.
Well, I can start with the most, the biggest frustration is top management and boards. They're too uninterested and know-it-all sort of, and are often in the way sort of. So as I said before, this is not weird and awkward anymore, but those guys in the top, that they don't sort of consider or try things on, that's a real hassle, and that's bad.
Yeah, I'm curious. I feel like this is one area that Erin and I might disagree on, which is, in my experience, I've been trying to disprove this for the last 5 years, that change and something transformative can happen without the CEO or the person with the most power, not only blessing it and sanctioning it, but actually and literally participating in it. I've yet to find a scenario where any transformation is possible without that happening. And I know that Reddy takes a slightly different perspective on that.
No, that's cool. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, because on the one hand, like there are a lot of people in our space that have that, like somebody's got to be all in kind of mode. And I guess I have two reactions to it. One is I sort of generally agree, actually. Like if you're talking about the container of one organization and what happens within it, I think you're kind of right, reluctantly. But I think a couple things are also true. One is organizations are not static and the membranes are very porous. And so our attitude is like a changed mind is a changed mind. And so I don't actually care if the organization that I'm working with actually fundamentally reaches the rainbow. I care about if 1,000 souls along the way have some awakening, what's the net impact of that on the change, the big change. So to me, it's a numbers game at some level. And then the other part of me is also comfortable with the compromise that, like, yeah, I might not get every client that doesn't have that top support, and I certainly would prefer that, but every client that doesn't have that top support is not a lost cause if we can make a 5 or a 10 or a 15 or a 20% improvement in the way of working. I still feel like there's some spiritual value in that, and some progress in that. So, but, point taken.
Yeah, I might add in there. I think at the same time, if you're going to do if you want the organization to shift, you need top leadership on board. And at the same time, I like to say you don't need to wait for permission from hierarchy to start practicing non-hierarchical ways. And I think there's so much creativity and space for an individual to start engaging just with yourself and in the safe spaces around you in your work, which might or might not lead to organizational change, but to not step into that based on, well, up there it's not going to ripple through all the way, really means you're staying in a place that's just, it's kind of sad to watch somebody have to just bear the situation without having any agency to affect their life. So the idea of leadership is for everyone. And so where within the spaces that you have around you can you start seeing possibility and potential? And I mean, I mean, I often talk with people, just start asking for feedback, or just, you know, where are the places that you're showing up with your own hierarchical assumptions, and what can we be doing ourselves? And so our own personal development is our number one easy access space to begin, in a way.
That's also the ugly for me, like that our personal development's involved, you know, that our psychology is involved, and that primarily the people that I'm working with are, you know, like in La Lu terms, they're usually green going to teal. They're already like got a lot of these values around inclusion and stuff like that. But the process of getting from green to teal, of like feeling the limitations of your current set of beliefs and ways of understanding the world, and having that breakthrough to come to this next stage, is really messy. Like, I'm looking at Susan. We've been, you know, stewarding and Spiral together for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years. And she has certainly seen me ugly crying a number of times, and I her, you know, like that's part of the work. We're in my view, we've been conditioned for hierarchy, and almost everyone has. There's some lucky few that escaped it, but most of us have been conditioned for hierarchy from birth, you know, and from every group and every institution we've touched. And then we try and find a different way of being. And for me, it's like, it's about as deep as you can get, the transformation that's required for people to really be able to live in a context of shared responsibility that's free of coercion, that domination is actually excluded from that context. Is really, it's asking me to be a different kind of person. And the process of going from who I was to who I'm becoming is like super ugly.
And I think another ugly thing, self-management and progressive ways of working, I think it's really, when you read about it, or when you look at it from the outside, I think it's really, you think it's really simple, and you think it's really easy. Like, for example, you read the books that all of us have written, and you might think, yeah, of course, there's challenges that people go through, and there's barriers they have to overcome, but we can do it, no problem. And then you start doing it, and then you get to the real tough part. Like, it's really rewarding, and you get so much excitement and enthusiasm when you are able to work like that, but it's really hard to get there. And even if you think you are there, if that's even possible, there's still new challenges and barriers to constantly overcome, both personally and as a team and an organization, I guess, which is what we're experiencing as well at Corporate Rebels. Like, it's easy to write a book about what you're seeing, but it's way harder to put it into practice in your own organization. When you have to go through tough feedback and self-set salaries and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's the ugly part. It's nice to read about it, and then you think, okay, well, we'll try it. And then you figure out how hard it is. And then a lot of people actually go back and say, well, maybe it's actually easier to work in a traditional company.
It takes ages. I mean, again, my lived experience, like, takes at least a year to even for the system, I'm talking at the system level again, to sort of adjust itself enough to like believe that this new possibility is real. And then like in the second year, it's like, okay, maybe a few experiments, but it takes so long. And that's, I think, Pim, why people give up, right? You know,
Karin doesn't agree with that, I guess.
Okay, let's go.
Oh, she's on mute.
Sorry, I didn't get that. So
no, Susan said it takes at least a year, and I said you probably disagree with that.
No, not really. It depends so much on the size, of course. And if you have the, you know, mandate and the whole mandate, it depends which role you're in, I would say. So I agree, it takes a long time if you don't have all the power to decide.
I'm curious what you all think about this question, because it's one I get a lot, and I have like a kind of blanket answer, but I don't know that I have like a buried down deep in my soul answer, which is this idea that like people with different levels of commitment, depth, understanding, intelligence, etc., people are not going to sweat this stuff at the level we're sweating it. They're not going to think about it at the level we're thinking about it. No matter where culture goes, no matter what happens, there's always a bell curve of engagement with ideas and philosophy. And I'm curious if you think that means that we can't kind of have it at scale. Like, can we really have, you know, big systems with hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom have been through, you know, without a total systems change of our economy and our educational system, can we have people just show up to work and play this game without the level of agony that we're all talking about and living in? And if not, then what does that mean for, like, should we be messing with the bigger systems first or this stuff? I'm curious what you all think about that.
I had to hear, sorry.
Yes. I had this old prophecy like 15 years ago about the big ones will fall apart and will be replaced by new ones. But I'm not sure. I don't know.
Rich, I'd love to hear you speak on this from the micro-solidarity perspective, because what comes into my mind when Aaron, you know, brings that challenge of hundreds of thousands of people, like I really feel like the micro-solidarity concept is the only way potentially to affect systems that large. That's
a really big call, the only way. What I was thinking when you were asking that question was about the COVID response in New Zealand compared to many other countries, and how, like, obviously, yes, there's been a very effective communicator in the hot seat, but also what was really obvious for me from someone who's from New Zealand but living overseas now is the reason that New Zealand has done so well with the pandemic, apart from the easy to defend borders, is social fabric. Is that there's actually a sense of mutual obligation, and that mutual obligation is held with joy and lightness and ease, that people care about their neighbors, you know, that they actually have a sense of shared identity that's meaningful. And that's what's been eroded for the last few decades. I don't know, in a lot of places that, like you were saying, Aaron, at the start, like you don't have this sense of community with your neighborhood. And I think that's basically the missing ingredient of a more effective kind of togetherness, is like learning how, like, where does social fabric come from? How do we weave it once it's frayed? And my, the whole thing with micro-solidarity is like, well, we have to learn how to do that. Like if it's being eroded, if it's kind of evaporating out of the system, we have to learn how to reconstruct it at the smaller scale. And maybe we can practice in a group of 5 or a group of 50 how to actually be with each other, how to show up for each other in a sustained way. And then a few groups of 50 and 50 groups of 50 groups of 50. And, you know, it only takes a few levels before we reach a really large scale system. But that's the leverage point that I'm most interested in leaning on. And it also transcends organizational boundaries too. And this whole thing of like, oh, where's the power in the hierarchy? Well, maybe your working context is actually super constrained and you haven't got much room to move, but you could invent yourself a new context, a new social context, and start practicing new ways of working, new ways of being together, where you're not having to ask for permission, that you can invent your own mandate and just invite people into it.
That's cool.
Okay, there's a question coming in from the audience, which Mark put in the chat. How do we get to a tipping point where new ways are the norm and not the exception?
Before you answer that, guys, I'm just going to ask James Snellgrove, please can you mute your mic? And authors, I'm going to be chucking in a few more questions for you to consider. So if the audience can hold on typing so that the authors can see the questions just for a few minutes, that'd be cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I think to pick up that question that you just threw in there, Pim, about the tipping point, I mean, in some ways, when I spoke to Margaret Wheatley, she shocked me a little bit by saying that we might not see a real shift for 300 years. But I think, I mean, I think about it as a spectrum, and I think we've talked to this as well, that on the one hand, yes, if you want a whole paradigm shift, then it helps for the whole organization to be brought in, including from the top. But as Samantha said, I also believe, you know, in Trojan mice and people not waiting for permission. And there, I think liberating structures is a good example of like change at the habit level. Like, let's do, you know, micro things, different things in meetings and how we distribute participation. And little bit by little bit, we'll start to nudge things in a different direction. So I think that's just one example, but I think also building on what we were just talking about sort of at scale and level of engagement, I think, yeah, authors like us who are really kind of wrestling with these things is going to be a very different picture to, I'm thinking about, you know, a nurse in Bertsorg, for example. You know, when I spoke to a couple of nurses there, you know, they weren't familiar with self-management or any of these kind of management thinking terms or whatever, but they knew in practice, you know, how to deliver great care and how to make decisions together, how to give each other feedback. They were kind of doing that kind of stuff. So they had a different level of engagement. And I think self-management for me has to be about allowing for those different levels of engagement. So it's not forcing people to be interested in governance, you know, if you know, like there's different, or I think about Hire, you know, and there are thousands of micro enterprises, and most of those people, they're just entrepreneurs, like working, they're not interested in sort of, you know, consent-based decision making or whatever. So I think it's about making things, designing a system and introducing practices that are really accessible, really simple, that we can change micro habit by micro habit.
Yeah, and I also I think we should forget about the whole tipping point and when we are going to reach it. We should just keep on pushing and making sure that more organizations are adopting it. More people want a way of working like this. And we can think about all the big changes and the systems changes that we need and changes in society that we need. But I think if we want to create change, we just have to do it. And every organization that joins that movement is another push in the right direction, which will, if we gather enough of those parts of that movement, we will be able to push over the old systems and make way for the new. And as with any change in society, I guess we should just invite everyone who wants to be a part of it, spread the message as much as possible and invite people to jump on board. And then let's see where we get. And whether that tipping point is what Malcolm Gladwell described at, I don't know, 17, 18%, whether it's at 50%, doesn't really matter. We just have to get going and keep on pushing to get more people into this.
I agree. And, you know, as much as, you know, the 7 of us in this little bubble and the other 212 people on this call, this isn't really in the zeitgeist yet, right? And so I think that part of the things that we can each do as individuals is just like talk to people that we know. Oh, wow, you know, there is a different way we can think about doing things. And I think that might not reach the tipping point, but that will bring more awareness and more possibility.
I love that. And I think, you know, to be really practical for a second, I think there are places in culture of birth and rebirth that we could be more aggressive about playing in and playing on. Like when companies are born, when companies are funded, when companies are bought, when they're merged, when leaders change, like there are moments where people's mindset is made and where their training occurs and where their understanding builds from experience. And I've been trying to get closer to the source of like the birth of something. There's no scale there. But there's a huge scale of impact in the sense that like, if you can affect a team at 10 and they're going to go to 10,000, that the lever on that is massive, but it's hard to spot that team. So I've been thinking a lot more about like, what's our role in funding? What's our role in private equity? What's all the stuff that Karin has played with. Like, I think that stuff is interesting for tipping.
And I think there's still some like really weird myths that are circulating really strongly, like self-managing is chaotic. I mean, I hear that so often, and if it's anything, it's more structured and more thoughtful and more explicit. And yet the assumption that's projected onto it when people haven't properly experienced it is that it has to be like it's chaotic, it's exhausting, it creates more conflict, you can't get things done, it takes more time. When in fact, when you've gone through the breakthrough, it can be all the opposite. And I think, one, we need to be writing more books and we need to be talking about it, but I also think that some of those things that are emerging in organizations that are moving forward on it, the more we start sharing them out and saying, hey, this, like, if we're open sourcing all of that out and go, here's a policy that's built on very simple, elegant guiding principles that can, and specific criteria that are explicit, that allow everybody to be sharing responsibility for this part here. And having more and more examples of that just makes the shift that much easier. I don't know about you all, but I mean, I've been living in this lab space for 13 years, and part of it is exhausting because whenever you reach out for some kind of business process, it's always shared out to you from a hierarchical, non-trusting assumption. And so you have to like get in it, analyze it, rework it, rethink it. And that's the exhausting part. But once we get more examples out, I think it's going to get easier.
I'm chuckling to myself because there's been a lot of optimistic talk, and I'm just like, I just don't share that optimism that I'm hearing. Like, I got into this starting in 2011, and I was mobilized by the Occupy Wall Street movement, because at that point I was just like, wow, things are so unequal and unjust and corrupt. Like, we really need to change things, and found about self-organizing and doing things in groups, and got into that action, you know, did the practice, committed, got doing the change, you know, did all that stuff. And I've been doing that stuff with all of my energy and all of my commitment, and pulling on all the levers that I can think of. And still, if we take an honest appraisal of where the world's at the moment, like, there are many parts of the world that are in a much less healthy place than they were in 2011. And I already thought it was bad then. So like, I'm not, I'm not fully committed to this idea that if we just bring our best efforts and our enthusiasm, there's going to be some kind of tipping point. Like, I'm not committed to a guaranteed positive outcome. You know, like, in my way of understanding the world, I have to allow for the possibility that things are going to go horribly wrong. And it's, the question is like, I mean, I was glad, Lisa, when you mentioned that 300 years thing. Like, I'm now currently orienting towards, like, maybe we are going through a 300-year transition, which is going to look awful at some of those points. And our job is to learn how to surf safely through, like, extremely stormy, literally stormy territory. And that what we're doing is, like, yeah, learning how to be at peace with the most extreme uncertainty. And I'm really not counting on a tipping point where it's like, hooray, we've convinced everyone, we've moved everyone to this new paradigm and it's really tidy. Like, I just don't see evidence of that happening. I mean, I'm willing to be convinced.
No, but I think you're right. I mean, all the transitions I've been through has been rough and painful and horrible at some points. And I think it's the same with the world, and we're not even knowing if where we're heading or on the right track. But I think it's the nastiness we see is part of the process in the best case, and we don't know.
Yeah. It's funny, I was reading an article the other day about, like, Zen without hope. Like, how do you play when you know it's not going to end well? And then what was really awakening about that for me was realizing, like, long arc of time, heat death of the universe, my death, your death, society is going to, like, let's assume it's not going to work forever. So then how do you want to play? So if you know it's going to end badly, how do you want to play? Or if you know it's not going to tip, how do you want to play? And I think where I land is, like, even if I'm never going to win, I still like to play this way. I like to play the way I like to play, and fuck everybody else.
And maybe we have to crush that myth about it being really happy-go-lucky when we're there, because it's hard work and very not glamorous. It's really sort of challenging and hard. That could be a contribution, just to have people get that it's not rosy and fabulous. It's really challenging, and also, but it has benefits, but it's not glamorous.
That's what I was going to say. And that when I was writing down before what's the bad and the ugly, I just wrote hard ! Because it's really tough. And I like what Frederick Laloux says about growth pain, and that the more we can create spaces for us to process and share and hear growth pain together, I think the easier it will be. Not in the sense that it will ever be easy, but we can be in it together, like you said, Richard, sort of surfing the wave somehow. And I think I was listening to a podcast the other day about a storyteller, I think his name was Michael Mead, and he was saying, maybe we should let this story die, like the myth of progress, you know, that, oh, we're always progressing, and maybe we should just let that go. And if we did, then we can kind of embrace reality with a new kind of sense of, you know, commitment to the work that we are doing, whether or not there's a tipping point, or whether or not, you know, it has the outcome that we want, that it's worth it anyway. Because, you know, like you said, Aaron, like, even if it's just one soul, one soul awakened, one soul rescued, that's worth it, isn't it?
It's like a preacher in church.
Yeah.
But I also think we shouldn't look at the whole world too negatively. I'm quite optimistic, also pretty naive. But also, if you look at some really interesting books coming out at the moment, Humankind by a brilliant Dutch guy, Rutger Bregman, which shows a much more positive perspective on what the world is like and what it has been like the past couple of decades. Or Factfulness by Rosling. Books like that also show an interesting perspective that, we always tend to think the world's going to end within now and a couple of years. There's crisis here, there's crisis there. Then maybe a couple of years it's nice and everybody's happy, and then we get into this crisis again. I also think we shouldn't be too negative about all of this. If you look at what Karin mentioned, like 20 years ago, people called you crazy when you talked about topics like this. Nowadays, people talk about it a lot, maybe not doing it that much yet, but we're getting closer at least. So I think there's reason for optimism as well. And look at the amount of people coming to sessions like this, where it's just 7 people talking to each other, and there's more than 200 people watching because they're interested in the topic and want to do something with it. I think that's encouraging. So we shouldn't forget about that too, that we are getting in the right direction, no matter how hard it might be, or no matter how many barriers there might be. I think that's an important one to stress as well.
I'd love to hear from everybody, just in wherever you've been active of late, some of the patterns that you're noticing as people shift in these ways. And I can just think about, where I am and offering just like really simple things that we see when somebody jumps into the self-managing bandwagon. And I think all of a sudden you need to decide everything together. So everything is done together all of a sudden. And I'm just wondering, are there other things that any of you are noticing? We could just start naming them, and just like there's so many of them that when people jump in, they're like, oh, it's not that. No, it's not that. And that is part of I think it's part of the journey. There's a few steps that you take that we could almost start naming and go, here's probably a few things you might experience on your journey. And then you get to the other side. And then it's this place where it's much more fluid and effective.
I totally agree with you, Samantha. It's the picture of how it should look that people have in their heads, and all of them have different pictures. So it's this frustration and confusing, and also the notion that it shouldn't be confusing. It should be really clear and in order. So that's really something. And I think Gary Hamel, I just came to think about, I guess it's many, but ground principles instead of ready structures. So, just organize around principles instead of that's what I tell people. It's not done, it's not like it should be is in a certain way. But there are some principles that are helpful, and then you will find your way. But I totally agree, Samantha, that's the hardest one.
I think plus one that, Karin, I think that what I'm seeing more and more is less of a need to have like the framework and the system to plop down and then everything will magically work, and more of this kind of recognition and realization that for each organization there's going to be a unique manifestation of what that particular group of people needs to flourish. And I think the second thing that I'm seeing and really taking heart with is more willingness for especially companies that have been around for a while to start to write things down, start to actually create artifacts of what's actually happening, how things are working. And again, for me, that's all part of the awareness thing, right? Like if we can be aware of the water, like, the whole, this is water, what is the water we're swimming in? The more options we have to make other choices.
I think we have to be aware of the pattern that we move, different parts of us move at different speeds. And so one of the patterns I often see is we get excited about an idea, but our somatic understanding of how the world works is still stuck in a different paradigm. And so then we're looking for the model, we're looking for the doctrine, we're looking for the dogma, the one way. that is supposed to be the answer, instead of recognizing that like actually that whole desire is part of that old thing that you have to part with. So that it's a weird like disintegration of yourself through the different layers of how you navigate the world. And I think just having some openness for that, and just awareness that like whatever you're craving in this movement and in this change, just check in with like, is that part that's craving that part of the change or part of the old is a weird, very challenging puzzle for me, that I'm always just like, wait, who's asking for that? Is that old me or new me?
Hey, all, I'm just jumping in because there's only 2 minutes left, and I thought I'd figure out in the hour that we had listening to you how to kind of close, and I haven't quite managed to do that. So I thought that we could just kind of end with with a quick checkout from each author. So yeah, any thoughts on the checkout question though? Or shall I come up with one? I can come up with one if you wish, but is anything burning for any of you guys? Okay, then I'm kind of curious to hear from you. Yeah, how you're feeling after listening to authors of other kind of great books. You've all written wonderful books, in my opinion, and yeah, how are you feeling after having conversations and kind of nutting it out on, agreeing and disagreeing on what the good, the bad, and the ugly is on new ways of working and self-management. So let's start in reverse alphabetical order. So Susan, are you okay to kick us off with how you're feeling after that conversation?
Time just flew, and I feel great, and I really would love to make space for more of this. And also I'm very curious about the Google Doc, and just wondering how we might orient around that, and collectively do something with it. Thank you so much, Mark, for this invitation. It's been great, and I'd love to do it again.
Sam, how about you?
Yeah, it feels like, it almost feels like we're entering a new phase in a movement by having conversations like this today. It was like, hey, there's a whole community of authors writing about this, and there's going to be more, and there's more ways of doing this. We're at the beginning of something. And yeah, just being in the conversation today makes me feel like we've probably just stepped to a new phase in the movement. So it feels great.
That's really cool. Thank you, Sam. Richard?
Trying to do reverse alphabetical and I'm failing. I'm very happy to be included in this. And like you say, like that, there seems to be a kind of self-awareness assembling in the field. I was just reflecting on my participation and thinking about how it seems important for me to chop down any traces of hope. That seemed to be what was coming forward in me. So I want to balance that out with encouragement as well, just speaking for myself, I'm a rank amateur, and I've just been trying stuff with people that are willing to experiment, and it's filled my life with the most extraordinary meaning and purpose and freedom and joy. And it's not because we figured out the answers before we started, it's just like about doing that experimentation with willing partners. And it's been, extremely satisfying. So I hope to encourage everyone, as well as threatening that we may be in the middle of the collapse of civilization.
Thank you, Richard. Pim?
That must be the angry marshmallow version of your head, Richard. I really enjoyed it. So thanks for organizing, Mark. I'd say let's do this again regularly, because it might be slightly weird that 200 people are watching a conversation of just 7, but I think it's really interesting to share knowledge like this and to learn from each other, and especially like if we can focus on more practical topics next time, that would be amazing. And I think a lot of people would be interested in learning from that. So I really enjoyed it, and I think judging by the comments, a lot of people did. So let's continue.
Thank you, Pim. Lisa?
Yeah, I'm sort of feeling a bit guilty because I know that there were some quite practical questions appearing in the chat, and I think we went a bit more philosophical, but I think perhaps that's because I think this movement is sort of evolving and moving, and we're all sort of exploring the next frontier, I guess, already in some ways. And I'm kind of left with Samantha's question about, you know, what are some things that you would notice if you started to implement this way of working? And sometimes when I feel a bit in despair, you know, is this really making a difference? Is this changing anything? I take part in a meeting with a team or an organization I'm working with, and I notice things like people making proposals instead of, you know, complaining or saying, oh, someone should, or people having difficult conversations or taking the initiative to restore a relationship, you know, a work relationship, or to sit in the fire of a difficult conversation. And when I see things like that, like I had a call just yesterday where I was like, I want to cry. This is so wonderful to see this. So when I see those little micro moments of people being and relating to each other and working together in a different way, then it feels like that's meaningful. So I'm sort of left with that each of us are kind of part of that fabric, I guess. And it's just, yeah, thank you so much, Mark, for organizing this. And I would, yeah, like to do another one where perhaps we could be a bit more practical as well, and always want to offer value.
Awesome. Yeah, themed repeats could be a great great thing to do next. Karin.
Yes, I'm just thinking that it doesn't really matter if we agree or if we disagree. That's totally irrelevant. And one thing that I have noticed working like this is that arguing is totally sort of not in fashion if you want to come forward. And that's so this right or wrong, or this is that, or that's not going to benefit. So doesn't matter if we agree, or it's just inventing, trying on and see what works and what doesn't, sort of.
Thank you, Karin. Really good point there. I loved it. Aaron.
Yes, alphabetically, I'm last. Okay, that's fun. I thought this was great. I think it's interesting to have this conversation performatively. I think it would have been interesting to see what this conversation was like without an audience, and sharing that recording as well. I like it both ways, so that's cool. I think if we do this again, I'd like to do it narrower and pick like one problem statement or one issue or one topic or one question and just beat it to death and get practical and get in a document and make a mess. I would also like to convene conversations like this more strategically. Imagine if everybody watching and everybody talking and writing books all agreed that like for the next month, we're just gonna go after VC and just give them a fucking hard time about like what the future should look like, what values matter, what principles are interesting, what would that be? Like, what would that even do to the world, positive, negative, or otherwise? I'm curious about that kind of organizing. So anyway, love you guys.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I was kind of surprised when you all agreed to this. I didn't expect, I kind of thought I'll aim for 7th because they won't all agree, and then you all did, and that just kind of demonstrates your generosity, and you all turned down the offer to plug your books, which just shows how passionate you are about the movement as well. So a huge thanks from me. We are going to, next up we're going to spend about 25 minutes. I apologize, we have run over a little bit. But in breakout rooms where we're going to kind of reflect on what you've heard, if you have the time to stick around. So now is the time to duck out if you'd like to. But before you do, we can kind of all unmute if you wish and have and show some chaotic appreciation by thanking all the authors.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Merci.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.